Let's talk about one of my favorite things to talk about because it's so important and there's so much information out there that I don't want to say is incorrect, but it's definitely not quite accurate. I think it's misleading to many of us. Now, when we talk about ego, what I want us to really focus on and deal with is the fact that the ego, most people will say, is the enemy. But in fact, the ego is not the enemy. What the ego is really is a lens by which we have our experiences. Okay. So when we recognize that the ego isn't the enemy, even though in many ways we can get into, and sometimes I get into this concept that the enemy is the inner me, right? Because really, outside of you, outside of your perspective, outside of your reality, outside of who you are and your identity, there is no enemy, right? The true enemy is your own limiting beliefs. Okay. That's the true enemy. So, yes, when we really break this all down, that looks like ego. But what I want you to understand is that that doesn't mean, or that does not lead to, or should not lead to, what many spiritual teachers will say is ego death. Okay. In other words, destroying, killing, getting rid of the ego. That would be the equivalent of, the sun getting rid of the moon. Okay. That would be the equivalent of hot getting rid of cold. You understand? That would be the equivalent of time getting rid of space. Okay. In other words, that's like you getting away with killing, destroying a very important aspect or element of the universe. Okay. That's like saying we can have something without experiencing nothing. Or that's like us saying we can experience happiness without experiencing sadness. You see what I mean? That's like you're experiencing or saying you want to be rich without having some level of experience of what it feels like to be poor or broke. You may not have that experience directly, but you know what it looks like, right? And you sure enough are clear that you don't want to have this experience. That's why we want to be rich. We have the experience of sadness, depression, anger. That's why we want to be happy. Okay. We need each other. We need these things to experience or desire the other. So with ego, okay, it's just simply one side of consciousness in many ways. That's how you can look at it. you know? So don't look at ego as the enemy that you need to destroy, that you're going to war with in a way that you need to kill off the enemy. If you want to look at it as going to war with oneself, which many of us do, look at that war, all right, resulting in not so much of a, killing, but of a bringing together, making allies, okay? Combining forces to have a unified front toward what? It's not about conquering, right? It's about peace. So don't think in terms of killing. Think in terms of bringing together, saying, listen, we're at odds with one another. How can we come to an understanding so that way we can actually create peace within oneself? And that's what you need to think about when it comes to your ego. Because we definitely get it twisted and we definitely don't realize that without it, you couldn't experience individuality. You couldn't experience contrast. Consciousness essentially uses the ego the same way light uses a prism, right? To essentially see all the different colors. So if there is, say this is what a prism, right, would look like, right? The light comes through it, reflects out, and thus makes all the colors of the rainbow. And so this prism here, you can say that this light can be consciousness, right? And then the prism can be ego. As you live out through your consciousness, which is the main source of who you are, right? The absolute core of who you are, you need the ego in this world to experience all of the colors, all of the amazing contrasts of this reality. That's why the ego is important. Imagine living contrast, experiencing contrast with no prism. It's just basically a flat line, a very boring existence. So when you think about it, right, when you compare being just completely without any kind of contrast or perspective or individuality, which the ego provides, then you don't have this. Okay? You don't have that. So I don't want you to get into this idea or get too stuck or too rigid with the idea of killing one's egos. Okay? If you want to have that, I guess, approach of addressing the ego, of conquering the ego, I usually use the word management of the ego because that's more appropriate with what it is that we're doing. We are just simply on this journey of bringing together all these different elements of self. Your conscious mind, subconscious mind, unconscious mind, consciousness, your ego, right? You're bringing all these elements together so that way they are aligned to express a particular experience that you desire to have. Thus, which is often called life, right? What kind of life do you want? In order to create that life, you have to bring balance and alignment to all those different things. And so the ego really is a lens by which we see the world, okay? Consciousness sees through you. So the ego just simply provides basically some shades, right? To kind of change the perspective of how you are seeing and experiencing things. You see? Now, what is the ego really? The ego provides separation, right? Why? You may say, why? Why do we need to have this idea of separation? What is that about? Well, basically, it gives you the opportunity, okay, to choose alignment, essentially. We're here to experience a particular game, okay? We've chose to come here to re-experience and come into self-realization, meaning you're here to relearn or reawaken to who you are. Imagine knowing all things, being all things. Kind of boring, right? That's like having the consciousness with no prism. It's just a flat line. It's just, yeah, you're existing. And even in that existence, you're happy. But it's nice to have goals, aspirations, desires. It's nice to have passions, hobbies. You see, it's nice to like people, right? Fall in love. It's easy to have all those different things. And those are based on attachments and non-attachments. So sometimes if we are experiencing attachments in a healthy way, it's a beautiful thing to experience. That's what life is about. So we were just pure consciousness without the prism, then, it'll be just kind of like, okay, we're here. I'm here. Great. But to come to this game where we can experience the contrast of different things and different people and different, opportunities, different adventures, that brings a lot of joy along the journey of becoming or being reminded of one's true self. So ego allows you the opportunity to choose alignment, okay? Because essentially you can't know unity, right, without one's feeling separate, right? And that's what I mentioned before. It's like knowing love. How can you know love, right, if you don't understand maybe hate or loneliness, right? If you don't know a sense of loneliness, then you cannot appreciate love. So hate, loneliness, these are all pretty much expressions of separation. They are all expressions of ego. Happiness, right? Sadness. Excuse me if I'm spelling things wrong. Sadness. Again, we're talking about the contrasts, right? You are a walking contrast. The universe is existing in a state of constant contrast. So if the ego here, you are, right, consciousness. So happiness represents consciousness. But in order to appreciate happiness, you must experience a state of separation from the ego, which is sadness. And remember, sadness is simply the other side of happiness, just like the ego is the other side of consciousness. This was a little bit messy, but you understand, and I'll get to more of it as we continue on. But you have to recognize that ego is just simply the other side of the coin of who you are. We tend to say, darkness. We make that such a terrible, terrible thing, a bad thing, even bad, right? We make that a bad thing. We make that this like horrible thing that is a representation of evil. Okay. Well, the great thing about darkness is when you experience it, you get a glimpse of light and what light is. The great thing about experiencing something bad is that you appreciate and seek to experience good. The great thing about evil, okay, is that when you experience it, you begin to desire, I guess another word for evil is good, right? So the point is here, I can just write that again. the point is, without the expressions of separation, right, which we often refer to as the negative aspects of self and the experience of life, without these things, you would not truly appreciate these things here. This is what the ego does. So it's understandable why people say the ego, we should kill it, right? Because it really is the basis for a lot of suffering. But suffering isn't necessarily a bad thing if you are managing it, if you are locked in and dialed into consciousness, you see, because separation is just simply a stage or a necessary part of growth, you know, like when you think about, say, let's see if I can do this right. A candle, right? And when you light a candle, and the candle can represent consciousness, it will show, right, some kind of a shadow, right? The shadow represents the ego. Consciousness, such a long word sometimes, but got to write it all out. So consciousness represents the light, okay? Whereas the shadow represents the ego. The light is real, right? But the shadow is really a projection, right? It's a false reality. It provides contracts. Very important to think about. So every time you see a shadow of something, think about that. Think about the ego and think about the shadow as something that it is, right? You see it, but it doesn't really do anything, but provides a perspective, you know? So when you recognize that, then you start to see things a little bit differently. You know, the ego, look at the ego also as like resistance training. If you go to the gym and say you lift, say I'll do this one. You put these plates, right? Plates on the barbell. Usually the place would be like, they'll say like 10 pounds, 20 pounds, 30 pounds, 40 pounds, 50 pounds, things of that nature. But really what these plates represent that you put on your barbell to lift up, to build strength, they really will say things like, or represent things like fear, comparison, even like doubt. And so think about the ego in this way. The ego is allowing you to build strength. It's allowing you to build resilience. And if you're not really mindful about it, if you're not approaching it and being mindful, just like management, right? When I talk about management, when you go into the gym, you have to manage your posture. You have to manage where you are right now versus how strong you want to be. If you're just coming into the gym for the first time and you're lifting weights, you're not going to lift 300 pounds off the ground. So you have to manage yourself well. You have to approach things according to where you are, right? Or then as you address these things, because essentially if you don't pick up these weights, if you don't approach your fears, how you compare yourself to others or your doubt or whatever it is that leads into the negative aspects of life and how you see life, if you don't lift up these weights, you're going to continue to be weak, essentially. You're going to be continue to be a pushover. Life is going to continue to continue to alert you, to give you these signals to address them. And that often will look like life is beating you up, really. Okay? A lot of people who are like, oh, life is hard. Life is a struggle. Life is suffering. Life is pain. Those are people who are not addressing these things. And you address them in the smallest ways possible until you get strong enough to lift up this 10 pounds without there being a problem. And then you move on to the next level. That's what the ego is for you. You are supposed to address these things that we all come in with, right? Because we're taught that from our parents, we're taught that from our society, from our culture. And so when you look at these things and you lift these weights, right, you address these issues, you get stronger at it, you get better at addressing bigger issues, right? And then you start to ultimately manifest, the life that you want because you took ownership. But it all starts with this thing called the ego, right? This supposed villain, this supposed enemy. Without this, life will essentially be an existence of no challenges, no demonstrations of recognizing who you are, right? No journey of rediscovery. It is basically you existing in a space where you're not learning who you are. And I know sometimes we think, you know what, I'm not mad at that. I just don't want to struggle no more. Well, the idea of struggle, the idea of things being hard, these are mindsets. You can go through something and simply just make a decision that it's not going to be a struggle, right? It may not be simple. It may have some layers of difficulty, or really it may require work, but you don't have to have this story in your mind that, oh, this thing is going to be a struggle. This thing is hard, is going to be hard. Whether or not something is hard or a struggle, the mindset you should have is, right, it needs to get done anyway. You got to do it anyway. So change your mind about the approach by which you do it. Don't approach something with the mindset that it's hard, that it's a struggle. Approach it with the mindset that it has to get done. That's what you are here for. You see? So, in a sense, the ego, and not in a sense, but the ego serves consciousness. We think ego and consciousness are opposing forces, right? That they're opposites, that they're enemies, mortal enemies, that they are after each other. But really, the ego is to serve consciousness. Why? Because it is to wake you up. It is to wake you up. Okay. So all of the negative things that we experience from the ego, those are things to shake. Those are shaking you. They're shaking you and waking you up. They're slapping you in the face. So that way you realize that you are consciousness. And then you are experiencing these negative things because you are not living up. You're not aligning with this consciousness. You are not waking up to who you are. When you don't know who you are, life is negative. Life is a struggle. Life is pain. Life is suffering. So the ego's job here on this earth is to provide you with that contrast, right? With that perspective or point of view, so that way you can question, right? So when you experience all these negative things, you are to question. You are to ask, why am I experiencing this negativity? Then from there, you are to ask yourself, what do I want from this life, in this life? Then you are to ask, who am I to be, or who am I in order to get what I want? Right? Who you are is consciousness. So it's very important you understand. Ego is part of the journey, is part of the game, is necessary. Okay. And there's not an other way around it. Like the ego serves consciousness so you can wake up to who you are, right? Consciousness, conscious means you are awake. It means you are aware. And the ego is going to be that thing that keeps poking at you, keeps shaking you, keeps drop kicking you, keeps clotheslining you, keeps running you over with that bus so that way you can wake up to it. So it's not about elimination of the ego. It's really about integration of the ego. When you recognize that the ego is really about spirit, right? Which we can often say is consciousness, right? Let's say ego, let's do it this way because this makes more sense since I already wrote down ego. Ego plus spirit equals you, right? Spirit, consciousness. I'll probably start writing spirit down instead of consciousness, but I like the word consciousness. It's just so long to write. But ultimately, ego plus spirit equals you. And when I say you, I mean the whole version of you, like you whole and complete. Not some watered down, corny version of who you think you're supposed to be, but the true and authentic version of yourself, you see? So this is about really balancing, right, the ego and the spirit and understanding truly that it's all about harmony between the two. Not a war, okay? It's about harmony. It's about taking the journey not to conquer the ego, but to bring peace, love. Just like back in the day when tribes used to go to war with one another, they realized, you know what? It doesn't really serve either one of us to go to war with one another, killing off each other, right? Beating each other up. How about we just simply marry each other? We take two royal families, right, of each tribe, and we marry. We bring the prince and princesses together, right? This is the basis of arranged marriages. And then we come together so that way two tribes really become one. That's essentially what you are to think about and do in your mind when it comes to your ego, when it comes to your spirit or consciousness. So, and one quick thing before I conclude, your ego can be compared to a GPS system, right? Global positioning system. We don't need to know that, but for some reason I wanted to say it because a lot of people don't know what that means. So anyway, your GPS tells you where you are based on, right, where you're going. And so when you are here and you're living a certain kind of level of health, right, that you may not be happy with, love and relationships may be at a place where you're just not satisfied, feeling passionate or anything like that. Money could be better, right? You're here, but yet you want to be here. The ego gives you the clarity, the coordinates of where you are, okay? And it's going to address by ways of like triggers, by ways of like, depression, emotions. It's going to give you certain signs that show you that you are not aligned, okay, with what you desire. It's going to show you that you are not aligned, period. If you're not clear about what it is that you desire, okay, because some people aren't. And that's okay. That's part of the journey. So you're here. You're experiencing all these triggers, all these negative emotions, depression, what have you. You're not in a place when you look at your life, you're not happy about your health, your relationship, your money, no sense of purpose, right? This is all these negative emotions are coming from the ego. The ego is trying to tell you something. Remember when I said the ego is constantly trying to shake you up, wake you up to something, some truth. It is you are misaligned. You are then supposed to ask the questions, okay, why am I feeling this way? What do I want? Who do I have to be to get it? That is what you are to take away from the ego in order for you to align with your desire. You see, that's what the ego's job is really. That's the ultimate job of the ego. So when you experience all of the symptoms of a mismanaged ego, that is not a call for you to quit. That is not a call for you to beat yourself up even more, right? That is just something to say, hey, we need to get to work, right? We need to get busy on some things. We need to actually be on this journey of alignment. So take note of the fact that everything functions in this reality from a space of contrast. You are no different. The gift that you have, though, is the ability to practice with your conscious mind how to assess what's going on in your life. To say to yourself, you know what? I'm not fully fulfilled in these areas of my life. I'm not fully fulfilled in life in general. So therefore, you got to ask yourself just some simple questions. Spend time with yourself. Don't allow yourself to continue to be distracted by, watching TV, social media, hanging out with friends who are not about doing anything special or productive in their lives either, right? Really spend time with yourself and asking yourself these questions. If you were to get the Future Self Journal, that allows for you to do that, right? That's what the mission is. The mission is to really bring awareness to all these things so that way you can address them and align with the future version of yourself that you desire to be. So with that, you take that information, you distill it, and you come to a place of clarity as to what it is you truly want, right? Who it is you truly know yourself to be. And remember, there's no difference between what you desire versus what you are meant to be. I really want you to understand that. You desire it because you are meant to achieve it. It is yours. So align yourself with the reality of the version that actually gets that done, because somewhere in this infinite universe, in all of these parallel dimensions and realities, there is a version of you that actually creates that, lives that has everything you have ever dreamed about. And when you simply follow the practices of the book and the journal, you align yourself with that and you become that version of you, not the version of you that wish they had or kept saying they will do it or one day, or I'm not made like that, or I can't do it. I'm not smart enough. I'm not this. I'm not that. The truth of the matter is you are that. That's why it's in here. That's why it's in your heart. That's why it's a desire in the first place. So go after it because it is yours. All right. Make sure you go to futureselffrequency.com, pick up the book and the journal. Thank you so much. Peace and abundance always.